Hello everyone. Welcome to Policy Central, your one-stop destination for all things policy. Today, we're discussing a very interesting topic, one that has put India yet again at the global center stage. India has taken on to the title of a Sherpa at the G20 summit. Well, the summit concluded last week at Bali, and India is yet to assume the inauguration, which is scheduled on December 1st. But what is G20 and what exactly does it hold for India? So Parul and I were discussing about G20 the other day, and we realized that the original idea of why G20 came into being and what are we moving towards to now as statements against war, conciliation between two global powers. Where exactly does G20's priorities lay? What are the objectives? And India as a head, what does it really hold? And what difference can India really make? Because as you might have noticed of late, India is having an opinion about everything and we are out there with what we want to talk about. So in 1990s, Asia had a serious round of financial crisis. Started with Thailand's baht being devalued and India's BOP crisis, and in both the circumstances, IMF was successful in bailing them out. But the issue about that is, IMF bailing out is not an insurance against economic crisis. It's just a painkiller. So when we look at the global south and the East Asian countries, what is the solution to economic crisis? And that is where the G20 came into picture. Earlier, G7 was a set of countries that had majority of the wealth, that were far more developed and had a say in the global happenings. And then another 13 countries sent out a priority list and an invitation and thus formed the G20. So, like we agree that G20 was purely an economic committee, something to solve the economic crisis. But we have far digressed from the topic now, right?
Yeah. So like if we look at how the whole Bali thing concluded, so what happened in Bali recently? Indonesia had the baton, and so G20's agenda was basically securing global economic growth and prosperity. The main crux of the agenda of G20 was that. But of late, G20 has also kind of become a little bit, we can see that the countries are not even united per se. Like we can see differences between the countries when in conclusion the president of Indonesia says it's G19 not G20 anymore. And so when we see that the current president of Indonesia, while giving the final speech, so they said that G20 is now G19. So which clearly sends a signal that the countries are not united and they clearly did not acknowledge presence of Russia as a member of G20. So that also brings us to the whole thing, is G20 way too large of an organization to find solutions to global issues? So that is one issue. And then if we look at the whole Russia-Ukraine conflict and the stance that Indonesia took, and Indonesia passed on the baton to India by saying end the war. So now India has the responsibility to also justify that statement and do our own diplomacy. So the crown that we've got of the presidency is a crown of thorns right now, because we have to very cautiously move forward and keep our ties intact with Russia also, but also take a global stance.
But so I'll go with the first point first. Is G20 too much of a bigger organization, right? The whole contention with before G20 was formed was that earlier there were very scattered blocks, and it was always the East Asian part of the world that was ignored or that had to be under a global superpower. And if you look at the 1990 world financial crisis, you can see that more than macroeconomic mismanagement, it was more to do with irresponsible and very speculative predictions of the southeast countries, southwest part of the world rather. So with G20, I think it brings into relevance that part of the world which has always been developing. Now, it's a different story that post the 1990s world, the finance crisis that India had, we had a relatively better economic growth. I mean, we really went far away from where we were that back then. We opened up the economy, we brought in a lot of privatization, we liberalized our economy, and today we are a contestant for the next superpower. And India's opinion does have a value. So that is something that has come out of I'm not completely contributing that success to G20, but I'm saying that the creation of G20 gave prominence to that part of the world. And again, the core idea was the developing countries and the developed countries coming together in a single platform. It is again up for contention that I think it was Norway that they had mentioned G20 is nothing different from G7, because earlier it was G7 in the rest of the world. Now it's G20, but within G20 you know that's particular section of countries that are making the decisions and the rest of them are following it. So I think that would probably put into perspective the whole idea of whether G20 is relevant. We're giving G20 an existential crisis, but I think it's something to ponder upon.
Adding on to the existential crisis that we just gave to G20, G20 also does not have any framework to measure the success if you have achieved some stability of any sort, or if you've achieved sustainable growth or anything. There's no framework in G20 to measure that. So it's just hollow talks. You come, you do your meetings, you meet your international friends, but then there's no framework to measure that. I have personally never come across a report that came after a G20 meeting or an agenda that was set up, and that after a year, that this was the progress that we made. Never.
And that is the other contention, right? Every year it changes. And of course, we have the Troika mechanism in place. The Troika mechanism being probably just 3 countries. So the current Troika is Italy, Indonesia, and India. So Italy was in 2020, 2020, Indonesia was 2021, and India was 2022. Now that we have taken over, right? So the idea of the Troika mechanism was to make sure that we are connected to the ideology of the summit before us, that was after us, and make sure our frameworks are in line, or our ideology or our core summit theme is in line with these 2 parallels. But the issue lies again, like you said, that what are we benchmarking it against, or what are our key indicators that these qualities have been met to? And it's quite interesting because Rishi Sunak very conveniently said that UK Prime Minister, India's Damaji Prime Minister, has very confidently mentioned, I'm going to sign off 3,000 visas. But is that alone going to solve our employment issues? Is that alone going to help in fast tracking our growth? No. And is that enough in today's time and age to mitigate issues? It is not. Those are very superficial topics when in comparison to what is going on in the world, especially with the war and presence that is creating food security and energy issues. This is not going to solve. This is not probably even the theme that we should be discussing in that platform.
Yeah. Now that you've brought up the war, so it's very interesting to see how India will walk this path. So when we talk about the war, and if we talk about energy, India is buying cheap fuel from Russia right now.
Yeah.
And with the whole discussion around ending the war and finding peace, etc. So it's very interesting to see how India will deal with the energy situation, because if we give up on the cheap fuel, we already are in a crisis. Our prices are rising, we have a coal crisis in hand, we have a petroleum crisis, and everything is going on. So how are we going to deal with that? And then comes the second issue, which is the food insecurity, right? So the war disrupted the supply chains, and India ranks 101 in 116 countries. We're on the bottom 15.
Yeah.
So that is the level of the hunger crisis in India.
And coupled with the population target that we've set recently.
So with that crisis in hand and the war in hand, and we know what is causing the problem, how are we going to walk this path? And that will be, I think, very, very interesting to see what will unfold in the coming year. And let's see what the meetings will turn out to be, and if we ever find a solution to that.
I think solution is a long way to go, because again we are targeting at a very packed year of 200 events across 32
Yeah.
cities, and it's interesting to note that Modi's statement, Prime Minister Modi's statement, had concluded with come to India, enjoy the rich heritage. It gives every delegate an opportunity to explore what we have to offer culturally, you know. As much as it's very nice and pleasing to sound, because we are 29 states, lot of tribes, communities, languages and dialects, dietary habits changing at every 50 kilometers. Is that all that we have to offer? Isn't it time we move ahead from talking about India as the land of Buddha and Gandhi and go at something that is more concrete in terms of technology or human resource, or our service sectors the biggest in recipient of FDI? So is India, are we restricting ourselves to being the beacon of culture in this 21st century, when the whole world is talking about warfare, defense systems, new tech, in fact, one of the, I don't know if it's a good part, but with the whole Russian war sequence that has happened, the Russia-Ukraine war sequence, there's a hit on fertilizer.
Yeah.
Now, it is a time that we are all looking at pulling back on chemical fertilizer and the use of fertilizers in farming. While it is a good way that we've kind of learning to reduce our dependency on fertilizers, the nature of that withdrawal is such that it's going to impact our agriculture, and it's again going to come back to our food security issues. Our production is again going to go down, and it's going to take a while before we get accustomed to organic farming. So it's...
So like one thing about the whole culture thing, right? So even when we launched our logo, our theme is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means, you know, it's a lotus, you know, and lotus is a symbol of culture. The logo is a lotus is a symbol of culture, and we have the logo, one earth, one family, one future.
And Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam also is like all world is one family,
yeah,
right?
all world is one family, right? But I feel that from the very beginning of our India's foreign policy, we really can't deny the soft power that we hold. So we have discussions around technology, defense, everything. But then if we have to attract foreign diplomats, or if we want to attract some foreign investments, we tend to use the culture card. But yeah, you're right, we tend to use it way too much than it's needed, and then India becomes just about culture. Right?
I'll tell you my main contention with that point, right? As much as it is flattering for me to probably, you know, walk out somewhere, I mean, so many times we see in YouTube, right? You just random Indian walking on the streets of New York, and there's this cab driver being like, "Oh, you Shah Rukh Khan, I love Bollywood." It's nice, it's flattering, but it's only a 2-second like flattery. After that, I'm genuinely concerned that is that the image that we're putting across? Because if you look, we have UPI, which is a hit, and it is a success factor in our technology. Isn't that something that we should probably be monetizing on? Not monetizing, but advertising on. And something that we should put out to the world, that this is something that we've created. It's worked in our economy, it's worked in our society, which is so diverse. We have a rural population, we have a suburb population and an urban population. It's a hit across the rural to the metropolitan.
Everyone is covered by...
Yeah. So that is something that we should be actively pushing forward. And as much as culture and heritage are important, it is also, we need to provide a promising future, especially when we are coming with a theme of one earth, one family, one future. We're still stuck in the past. Where are we with one future?
So I guess what the future holds is a women-led growth. And I think like the way our Prime Minister very openly mentioned that in his opening speech also, that women-led growth probably is the next path towards a more sustainable, a more inclusive and a more equitable future. And it is one of the main focus points of our G20 presidency as well. And adding to that, about the whole future thing, the post-COVID resilient recovery is one of the agendas, and it's not just recovery of India, it's a global recovery that we want.
Yeah.
The recovery of Southeast Asia and the recovery globally, that is how we all will be able to, you know, rise up the COVID crisis for real, for real.
Which is quite ironic because that was the main theme for Indonesia's, and it was also for Saudi Arabia's
Yeah.
and Italy's, because Saudi Arabia, when took over the role of the Sherpa, we were going through the pandemic, right? And then came Italy, and it was the stage 2 or stage 3, the third stage of
Third.
The pandemic, and then came Indonesia, and we're still talking about pandemic. So that's going to be interesting.
So let's hope like this time the talk about pandemic is over and we legit, you know, achieve a recovery situation. Also, one more thing, like it's like a probably minute observation, but the whole presidency is also a chance for India to delve into its IT, tourism, hospitality sector as well. With the meetings being, you know, held in different cities across India, we will have diplomats coming, but that will also garner a lot of attention towards these cities, and it has a tendency to, you know, boost tourism in these places, and with tourism comes hospitality, the service sector and everything. And like, we can't deny the fact that India is service sector run, right? And India is a place of all terrains, and we are a very proud tourist destination. So that is also a small opportunity that comes with the whole presidency. So let us just hope we take it well and we walk the path properly, and with caution comes,
You know, I think caution and leadership always go hand in hand.
yeah,
It would be interesting to see what India will do as a Sherpa, because again, culture is definitely our USP. At the same time, culture is not all that India has to
Yeah.
offer. And this is the 4th time in the history that a developing country is becoming a Sherpa for G20. Earlier it was Argentina and a few others. So it does hold a huge opportunity, and especially with India, it's interesting because India is slowly drifting out of its NAM stance. And in a way, we are definitely holding the middle ground, but at the same time, when needed, we're giving out a very strong opinion. So it is a lot of hope. It's a lot of busy days ahead for India.
Yeah.
I mean, 32 cities and a lot of events, a lot of themes: business, finance, health, education, women, gender. There's so much to offer. There's so much to really develop. A lot to put behind us. A lot to carry on with us. The war definitely looming low on our heads. It's still not done with. So let's see where it goes to, right?
yeah. It will be an exciting journey, I think.